Welcome to Ultimate DIYer. Today we're going to be working in a master bedroom where we're going to repaint the entire bedroom, and we're going to put caulking around the ceiling where they have trim. It's kind of a vaulted ceiling. People tend to walk on it. It pushes that down and it creates a problem. So we're going to re-caulk that. We've got several little cracks. We're going to use hot mud to try to go ahead and put it on there without having to use a lot of mesh, because there were just small surface cracks. They're not deep cracks. If it's deep cracks, I generally will use mesh and hot mud. So I'll kind of show you how we do that, and I'll explain why we do that. So stay tuned and let's see what you can learn today.
So on a project like this one, the very first thing you're going to do is go around the room and clean up all of the drywall. Looking for cracks in the drywall, looking for small holes, seams, anything that you can find that needs to be cleaned up before we start painting. So what you're seeing me do here is basically I'm cleaning out those cracks and making them a little bit wider so that the new mud will have something to hold on to, and making sure that there's nothing that's going to flake out in the paint. I did have a conversation with the customer before I started this project to make sure that these seams or these cracks that you see do not expand and get worse as the season goes on. That generally means I have a settling issue. These seem to be just small surface cracks. I think that some of this mudding was done later on after the house was built, and I don't think they did a very good job. Normally on a situation like this, I would have cut it much deeper, much wider. I only went about 1/8 of an inch deep here on most of this, and it's more at the very surface. But like I said, if it had been worse, I would have cut a little bit wider, and I would have sanded further out, taking the texture off, and I would have used a mesh tape with hot joint compound, which will dry a lot stronger than your normal pre-mixed bucket mud that you get at the big box store. This is one of my regular customers, and we'll keep an eye on these seams, and if they do split again and the house is settling, then I will end up having to go ahead and sand a lot of the texture down flat, and we'll have to go ahead and use mesh, and I'll have to come back and retexture probably the entire wall to make it look correct. If this had been common knockdown or orange peel, I would have more than likely went ahead and cut it out a little deeper and used mesh from the very beginning. Matching textures can be an art form all in itself. You don't know what the humidity was the day it was installed. You don't know how much actual water was added to the mix when it was installed. You don't even know what tools were used when it was added. So anytime you find holes like the ones to the right of this box, you need to take like a Phillips screwdriver and punch the hole inside so that you make sure that the new mud has a place to hold and it doesn't stick up. It looks smooth. If you don't do that, you'll definitely be able to tell. This is the ceiling trim around the vaulted area that I was talking about, and what I'm pulling off of here is caulking that they actually used to give it a little flexibility when people crawl over the vault up in the attic. This part of the project was tedious, but if you don't get that old caulking out and it's pulling away, even if you put new caulk over it, it's going to end up splitting again. So you have to get that old caulk out of there. This particular corner had small hairline cracks going down it. Here again, I don't think it was the house settling as much as it was poor installation. And then also I think people would put their hands on this particular wall as they walked to the bathroom, pushing against the corner. So again, all I did was take out enough of the old drywall just to be able to place a little bit of new hot mud inside of the cracks to make it hold. So I did find several spots over the doors with small cracks. Now this usually is an indication that the house has moved some, but this house is 60 years old, so that's kind of a normal thing. Now before you do any sanding, you need to make sure that all the curtains and things are actually off the walls, because they'll hold a lot of the drywall dust. Be sure you're using plastic in doorways that you don't want dust to go to. Make sure that you have tarps down if you haven't already put them down. If you noticed in that picture, I also had a big air scrubber I used quite a bit to make sure that I kept dust out of the customer's home. All of my seams now are open and ready for caulk, and all of the cracks and all on the wall are ready to start mudding. So that'll be the next phase.
Okay, so now we're at the caulking part of this project, where we're going to put caulk across the trim on the ceiling. And I'll show you a close-up of that in a minute, but I want to show you the caulking gun and the caulk that we use. I usually use this Alex caulk, A-L-E-X, and I usually get it in white. They're paintable. You have a couple of different types. You have a 25-year and you have a 40-year. Both of these are paintable. On this project, we're going to go ahead and go with the 40. You're going to need a good caulking gun like this one or something similar to this. These caulking guns have a release mechanism here. I'll show you how that works. Actually, I'll pull this one out. Take the caulk out, right like so. And so this is your releasing mechanism. And this right here is where you'll actually puncture your tubes. You don't usually have to puncture them on caulk, but you will on silicone. And I'll show you that in a second, which we won't have to do that. But if it was a silicone, you would take the end of your caulk after you cut it and you'd puncture it, push this on and puncture. There's also a cutter here, which I'll go ahead and show you. Here's our 40. We take it, I turn it sideways just a little, snap it. Now, some people like to use a razor knife or scissors. That's great. Me, I don't want to spend the extra time. I'll cut it right here and I'm good to go, and I'm rocking and rolling. So I take the caulk, I put it in, push it down, and start to squeeze, and I'll feel it start to make pressure. There, it's already coming out. Now, a key here, I'm going to show you this. I've got it coming out. If you've never used a caulk gun, it's squirting. Take and push this little release button at the bottom for the back bar. It'll quit coming out. Some people don't know about that, and it creates a big problem later. So it's nice and clean. So you will need usually a bucket. My bucket is on the other side of the room, but I'll take a bucket and put a towel in it and keep it wet, and that I can kind of clean up as I go along, because most of it, use your finger to clean up the caulk, straighten it out. Then I go over it with a wet rag just to make it look nice and smooth. Another thing you may need is called backer rod. This will come in a bag. It's wound up, plastic bag. You'll get it at the big box stores, Home Depot, Lowe's. It'll be in the same section that your weather stripping and all is in for, like doors. And it is literally called backer rod. And what this does is, if you have a large gap and you're trying to fill it, instead of trying to squirt a ton of caulking in there, which doesn't really work very well, and it'll shrink up and you have big holes, you put this in first, squish it into the hole. And this comes, by the way, in several different sizes. This is the thicker one, but they have thinner ones as well. Push it in there. Make sure it's underneath the surface so that it doesn't stick out and you have gray sticking out. And then you caulk over that. That saves you a lot of caulking time, and it works really well. A lot of guys don't know about backer rod. So anyway, let's get to it. I want to get up there and I'll show you how this actually works. So this particular area here has some pretty good gaps in it. I don't know how well it shows up on the camera, but they're fairly deep. So we're going to run a bead starting back here. And as I get closer to the deep area, I'm going to push a little bit harder on the plunger right in here. Make that fill in just a little better. Now I am doing this the day before, so
If it shrinks up some by tomorrow, I can put a quick little layer back on it. And I level it off. Just like so. Yeah, right there. Get that in there good. Now, so this doesn't look tacky. You're going to want to go back over it with the wet rag and take off the excess, kind of smooth your corners like so. Once you paint it, it looks really nice. Right there. Let's see here what we got. And like that. Like I said, some big areas here. And normally you would want to fill that with mud if it was not on a vaulted ceiling where everybody keeps walking on and splitting it. The air conditioner happens to be in the other side of this wall, on the other side, so they crawl over the top and crack this over and over.
Please take a second and smash that subscribe button, that like button, and be sure you ring that bell notification button so that you know about all of the upcoming videos. Wood will expand and contract as the seasons change, and that's why we use caulk in those areas. So now I'm mixing up some fast setting compound. If you noticed in that picture, it's got a 45 on it. That means I have 45 minutes working time to get that on the wall. It sets up by chemical reaction extremely hard and fast. Now when I apply the mud, I tend to leave it just a little thick so that I can go back and sand it a little smoother. I would also use my hand to try to feather the edges out, so that way the existing texture will help match the new texture that I'm putting on. Make sure on all of these longer lines you're feathering the edges as well. It'll definitely make it a lot easier. I come back and wet sand a lot of these areas just to make it look nice and blend. I'm filling in nail pop areas now where people have walked across the ceiling on the top and caused it to push down and break. Now it's time to start wet sanding.
I'm going to use a little water and a wet sponge. And this sponge, you can use them over and over again, clean them out. They're great for a DIY or great for a handyman to keep several of these around. This is a 60 grit. You can get them in, I believe, 80s and 120s. It's a little bit aggressive, but I want to knock some of this down. So I want to smooth some of this out a little bit. Wet sponge will keep me from having too much dust put in there. Knock down some of these high edges. I can still see a little bit of line here. I'm going to try to flatten some of that area so that that kind of hides that a little. You got to remember it's going to stick out more right now because it's wet, but you want to feather these edges down quite a bit so that they look very similar to the edges here. If you have a really sharp edge, that's going to show up. So we want to we want it to, if anything, look erratic, like it's going around. And we're trying to get rid of this hump right in the center. Get rid of some of that look. This part of the job is a little tedious, it takes a little time, but if you don't do this right, the finished product is, you're going to be able to tell. Now remember, these are all flat, and you have a lot of flat edges, so we can flatten a lot of this, and it's going to look right. Like so, starting to look a little better.
I did have to work quite a while on that center line to get rid of it. I also used a small tip screwdriver to help cut and recreate some of the texture lines.
Get a little more water. You want to keep rinsing your sponge out and getting it wet. Now, if this was regular compound, it would come off a little easier, but this is that rougher compound. Sometimes circular motions work a little better to hide an edge.
If you learn just one thing from watching this, the most important thing that you can do is make sure you spend the time to feather all the edges. If you don't feather them, I guarantee you when you put that paint down, you're going to see your lines. That's probably the most common DIY mistake I see, is the fact that the edges were not feathered. You have to go back and correct a lot of that. Matter of fact, I have to do that here in a few minutes.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys can see this in the video, but there's a line here where it was a previous repair, apparently, for people crawling over this vaulted ceiling, like I said. And what they did is they put the mud on, but they didn't sand it enough, so that whole line shows up. So what we're going to do is use the power sander to sand it down and try to smooth it and smooth these out. Usually you keep it flat, but I'm probably going to have to tilt it on edge a little to get some of this groove out so that I can break this up and it doesn't show up. Now you'll know you're removing the line when you start seeing this white part grow away from the paint, which means I'm trimming it down flat. Tell you what, let me grab a dust mask, PPE, glasses and mask.
So now it's just a lot more sanding and feathering. Very tedious and time consuming, but it has to be done. So this is the end of day one. Stay tuned for the next episode where we actually put the wall paint on and all of the trim paint. And thank you for watching.